This is deep dish, right?
Yeah, well, let's get deep.
So I'm going deep on both sides.
Senator Yarbro, welcome to the platform. How you doing?
Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. Crazy 4 months that you just went through. This your first thoughts being in session.
So I just finished my ninth year in the Tennessee legislature, and this last 4 months has been the absolute hardest and most disappointing. It's been sort of riddled with extremism and focused on sort of culture wars from beginning to end, and really failing to respond to this moral challenge that I think presented itself to our community so starkly with the Covenant school shooting. And not only did we not do anything good out of that, we instead made a national embarrassment of ourselves in the legislature. And I think it was a hard few months.
As you reflect on that experience, these last 4 months, how do you correlate that and go to now running for mayor? And what has all this happened and transpired, what that may mean or may not mean for Nashvilleians and the role that the mayor plays into that?
Well, look, I think what I have always tried to do in the Senate is try to lead people towards common ground, to bring people together to work on real problems. And we're living in a time when all the sort of national media and too much of our legislature is just driven by what's the culture war we're going to fight this week, what's the culture war we're going to fight that week. But while that's happening in real life, people are getting priced out of their homes. People getting losing children to gun violence. People aren't getting the opportunities to, for education and job opportunities to actually make the kind of life that they want to make.
Right.
And I am so excited about the prospect of being in leading the city as mayor to try to actually bring together people, focus on the real issues, and get work done for the city.
How pivotal will be whoever the next mayor is, you as the potential next mayor, how pivotal will that mayoral state relationship be? And how does your role as senator now play a part of that? Whether does it help, does it hurt?
Oh, well, I think it no question helps. Look, this is not a business as usual mayor's election. We do not live in the time when Mayor Carl Dean could go down the street and have lunch with Governor Bill Haslam, and the relationship between the state and the city was on track. I mean, if you look at what they did this year, they tried to cut the council in half. They took over control of the airport. They took a minority control in the sports authority. It's limited what we did on the convention center funding. They gutted our community oversight board. And that's just the things they passed. They talked about doing even more. And so I think the next mayor is going to have to navigate a really complicated relationship, which is what I've been doing for the last 9 years, playing defense and offense for the city. And there's times that you've got to know when the city's values and its people are on the line. Those are moments that the next mayor's got to be willing to stand up to the state government and fight when that's the case. And I think that Nashville has seen me do this work and can trust that's exactly what I'll do. But I think that on the other side of that, the next mayor of Nashville isn't going to succeed if they don't find ways to partner with the state whenever and wherever possible. Because if you're talking about education, you're talking about housing, you're talking about economic development, transportation, it doesn't matter. The state is a partner that we would like and an obstacle that we should avoid in all of that. And I think the next mayor is going to need to work with department heads and committee chairs and legislators, and not starting from scratch in that environment is a huge advantage, because I think they respect that if I'm fighting that fight, they know that I'm serious about it and that I'll fight but they also know that if they want a serious partner to solve problems together, that I'm that partner. And I mean, I've worked to reform DCS with, in a bipartisan way. Over the last 9 years, I've passed some 80 pieces of legislation that are all bipartisan that still make real differences. So I've learned how to navigate that space, and I think the next mayor is going to absolutely have to be able to work with the governor and the legislature to do that.
What is on the line if we don't get the right mayor to lead Nashville in the next 4, potentially 8 years, almost a decade, right? In Nashville.
Oh, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think the city is really at an inflection point, right? In September, we're going to elect our 5th mayor in 9 years. And it feels like we're going to be electing our 5th mayor in 9 years. I don't think we've had really a collective sense of direction for the city. And we got some real problems out there.
Right.
And I think that if you don't have someone that's going to build back trust in Metro, if you don't have somebody who's going to try to make sure that our growth isn't happening to us, but it's happening for us,
Right.
then I think we're going to be in a bad track,
Right.
and it's going to be hard to make the recovery that we need.
Why now for you? Run for mayor. Been in the Senate legislative for a while. You can probably still continue to do that. Voters know you. You've done the work. Why do you feel like at this point in your career, running for mayor is something that you feel you want to do, need to do, and Nashville needs you as our next mayor?
Well, working with the last 4 mayors over the last 9 years, I know the difference between when the coalition of this city is built and when it's not. And when the political leadership, civic leadership, business leadership, and people of this community are on the same page, rowing the same direction, the city's unstoppable.
Right.
And we can get things done at the state, we can get things done locally.
Right.
But when we're divided as a city, or when we're just not on the same page,
Right.
I think we really can get picked apart. And I think that part of the challenge that we're dealing with right now is like folks ain't come together
Right.
to deal with the challenges of this moment. And when you're one of 6 Democrats and a 33-member legislature, your job is about building coalitions.
Right.
And when you represent one of the most diverse districts in the state of Tennessee, your job is to build coalitions. And I think that the work of bringing this city together to solve problems right now is perhaps the most important work ahead.
All right. What I'm gonna get straight to this on this. What makes you more qualified than all the 100 other people that are running for mayor right now?
I mean, we might, no telling how many people are going to be in before it's all over. But look, I think that this is a job that requires knowing what political leadership is.
Okay.
There's sometimes that you got to make real hard choices. And the virtue that everybody ought to look for in all their politicians right now is courage. Like, it's one thing to be kind, it's one thing to have good plans,
Right.
but if you don't have the courage to stand up for those when things get hard, then it doesn't matter of how good your ideas or how kind your intentions were.
Right.
And I think that people can at least trust, having seen me do this work, that they know what my baseline values are.
Right.
They know that I'm going to listen and try to bring people together and actually solve problems. And I think that being able to build trust right now in the city is a vital piece of business. I've also been up close and personal with the state-city relationship for the last 9 years, and have helped oversee a $50 billion budget at the state, and try to make those processes work better, try to reform the way we do government contracts. I mean, so I have deep experience on all of our issues, from housing to transit to economic development, and a unique perspective when it comes to dealing with this new challenge that, frankly, no other mayors really had to grapple with before, which is how do we deal with managing our city in a much more complicated environment with the state government.
If me and you was on the elevator, right? Say we just going to the 5th floor, the floor that we on now, we got maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute if somebody else is getting off on another floor, right? And I'm a Nashvilleian, and maybe I knew who you were, and I knew the mayoral election, but I didn't really, I was going like, who face do I see
Right.
most, right? And I asked you, right? We got 30 seconds to a minute. I said, hey, I don't know really what's going on in the city, but why should I vote for you? Well, why? What would be that pitch? What would be that elevator pitch on why? If it's a lot of new Nashvilleians. A lot of people are uninformed and they just living their best life here, but they're going to be potential voters. What would that line 2-3 statements be?
I mean, look, I think the city's got to get its swagger back, right? I mean, most cities in America would trade to have our sets of problems.
Right.
But what's new and the thing that disturbs me the most about where Nashville is right now is we've gotten this sense that we're not up to solving them. And I think that, look, we're not the first city to deal with homelessness. We're not the first city to deal with traffic.
Right.
But what we can't do as a city is feel like these problems are too big for us. But what that means is you got to have leadership that's comfortable and is going to actually bring people together, sit around a table, and get things done. I believe that the most powerful weapon in the mayor's arsenal is the conference room table, where you genuinely bring in stakeholders from around the city and make sure that when you're making decisions, you're not making decisions that change people's neighborhoods forever without their voices being represented.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's important to highlight for those who are watching and listening about the corridor that the mayor's office is, right? Connecting grassroots organizations, private, public, all of these kind of entities of people that do work, and the mayor's office is supposed to use those resources to help to make this city better.
That's right.
Right. I want to go. You keep mentioning solving problems, right? We have a lot of problems and challenges in our city right now. What I like to do first is I like for you to highlight kind of those challenges that that stick out most to you, and we kind of unpack those one by one. And really kind of go into that vision, right, of what Nashville would look like as you as our mayor, which is, we're a very mayor-led city, top-heavy mayor-led city. So it's a crucial role to understand what that means in that vision as you as a potential mayor.
Yeah. Well, being able to afford a home in a neighborhood you love, that's near schools you trust, shouldn't feel like winning the lottery.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I think everybody wants to be able to afford a home in a safe place that has some sense of community. I think people want to be able to feel like their kids are going to get the best shot at education. And I think they want to be able to move around their city without having to get a tire change or use your GPS every 10 minutes. I think it's really about insisting that the quality of life of Nashvilleians doesn't get sacrificed in order to grow and develop.
So we're talking about that housing. A lot of the questions is how do we pay for that, right? We need 30, 50,000 units. So somebody knows who knows when it comes to just putting a Band-Aid on the crisis, or being able to find affordable housing. And if I understand right, affordable right now is like $900 and something a month. That's affordable,
right?
Which is crazy. How do you tackle that from just a funding standpoint, and being able to we have to build these things, right? And as things take time, it costs more money over time. How do we tackle that, or what's your vision to at least help be transparent for Nashvilleians to understand, this is the issue, and this is how I would plan to solve it if elected?
So let me answer that in two ways. So first, I passed the first legislation to let Metro invest money in affordable housing, to actually appropriate dollars into the Barnes Fund. I actually tried to sponsor legislation this year so that the taxes we collect on our Airbnbs and rentals,
Yeah.
those short-term rentals, so that money doesn't go into promoting tourism, but goes into affordable housing, because that's the problem that it's helping drive, right? And so I think a lot of it is about how you do leverage those dollars. But you get those dollars, look, I think looking for those new sources like like what I said, like trying to get some of the short-term rental dollars into that space, or whether it's some of the fees that come along with developing new property.
Right.
But I also think that too many people think about affordable housing as what's the government going to build?
Right.
What we got to do is make it a downhill task to build housing that's affordable and accessible across lots of income levels. I mean, you mentioned like $900 is affordable, but like it doesn't matter what income level you're at, the number of accessible housing options aren't enough.
Right.
And you can't have a great city when your cops and firefighters and teachers can't afford to live here.
Right.
You can't have a great city when someone who wants to downsize from a house to a 800 square foot condo can't afford to do it.
Right.
Or can't figure out a way to get a cash offer in hand to make that happen.
Right.
And so I think we got to create a lot more. Affordable housing is not one of these like silver bullet, like one policy that fixes it all.
Right.
It is a block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, day by day kind of thing. You got to make zoning easier, permitting easier. One of the things I did in the legislature this year is pass legislation to speed up the codes inspection process. And that may sound small, but like when you got 6 codes inspectors, each with 300, dealing with several hundred, codes, places to inspect, you build in delay, which means that there's more construction going on in your neighborhood for longer. And it means when you ultimately start buying or renting that house, that you've got to pay more, right? Exactly. And so we got to find all those different ways that we're driving that cost down, so that there's more abundant housing, so that people can afford it.
What I heard in that too is mobility, right? Being able to get around and not being in traffic. And so there comes the one of the $1 billion questions is that transit, right?
Yep.
Are you in support of something like dedicated funding? We had a referendum that failed in 2018. Is dedicated funding something you support?
I do support dedicated funding. So I was on the board of the MTA.
Okay.
Before I was in the Senate. I was actually chaired that board when we hired the current director. And one of the first things I did in office was sit with Bill Haslam when he was working on the Improve Act, which is where we got the legislative authorization to do dedicated funding in the first place.
Exactly.
So I'm very much in support of moving our city towards that point. I have 2 things. One, I think when people don't trust you to fill potholes, it's hard for them to trust you to start to build put $1 billion into mass transit. Yeah. And I think we got to be more responsive to people's everyday transportation needs right now. But also my philosophy on this is, we had Mayor Dean had his AMP proposal, Mayor Barry had and Bradley had the proposal that was put up for an election and defeated. The Coopers had his own plan. At a certain level, when you're building transit, you got to be building for what's going to get created a decade out.
Right.
And I think you got to get past thinking about, I'm going to be the one that does the groundbreaking or the ribbon cutting. And we got to get the city on an actual long-term strategy and funding plan that's going to make sense, not just for the next 8 years when I hope to serve, but for the decade after that.
Right. Do you have a sense of pulse, even from the state level, of Nashville being able to have that mass transit that would also ultimately support the region, right?
Well, this is like a fascinating chicken and egg thing that we've been working on for a while. And I think one of the biggest upsides of coming from the state is that I have worked really closely with mayors and legislators in some of our surrounding areas, because it's kind of hard to explain to Nashville why transit's going to work if it's not going to incorporate the people who are coming in from Rutherford County every day. But it's also hard to get folks in Rutherford County to agree to to a light rail that's coming up if they can't get around Nashville once they get here.
Right.
And so I think we got to be building that in tandem with the state. And so, I think that corridor between here and Rutherford County is the one that where everyone should be initially focused. I think that also allows you to hit the airport area,
Right.
and it's a place where we've got the right of way to actually build up some rail transit. But I think we're also going to need to prove to people in Nashville that transit works in order to get them to invest the next step.
Which is crazy to me. It's like, hold on, look around. Like, this is what happened when we don't have it at all. You can't get no.
Right.
It's only gonna get worse when we.
I mean,
don't
what
have
we
it.
should do on transit, like the best thing we could do is actually design a time machine and go back 20 years and build some mass transit, right?
And that's what I try to, I guess, help people understand. Like, one, this is gonna take 10 to 15 years, but we at least have to start with an area, right? If this that Murfreesboro Road, like, we got to start with something so people can see, like, hey, this worked, it's efficient,
Right?
It helps everybody. Now let's build plans around the whole region in order so people within Williamson, Mount Juliet, Rutherford County, Clarksville, all of
Right.
these spaces, because what people are doing, which is kind of doesn't really make sense to me, is okay, you work in Nashville, but because it's too expensive, you don't live in Nashville, but you're gonna spend $500-$600 extra a month on gas
Right.
coming into Nashville, which could go to potentially a rent or mortgage to live in Nashville.
Yeah.
But maybe you can't afford the car to live in Nashville if it's.
Well, and I think part of what you got to do is part of the reason that housing is so important is one of the ways you deal with traffic is you don't have everybody doing these trips all the time.
Right.
People actually want to live here.
Right.
But I mean, you got all these people that are moving to town that like want to be in a city and raising their families in the city, but like, well, where are you gonna go?
Right.
And certainly, where are you gonna go if you're not making, some ungodly amount of money?
Right. Exactly.
And so I think we've got to make sure that there's more options. So that there's a lot of people that don't want to have a car.
Right.
A lot of people at least don't want to have two cars in their family, but we got to make sure that life is possible for that, which means both building walkable neighborhoods and then finding those other ways that people are connected to, to places of opportunity and the things they need.
I'm going to stay right there on neighborhoods a little bit and talk about preservation and change. I know we talked about housing. What comes with that change is gentrification, right?
Yeah.
And along with mobility and sidewalks and things like that. How do we preserve the soul of Nashville, get that swag back of Nashville, but also understand, like, okay, we're moving forward, we're growing, jobs are coming here, people are moving here from all across the country, and abroad, but how do we still preserve these historical neighborhoods and still pour into them and don't historically neglect them,
Right.
like we've been doing for forever, right?
For literally free.
Yeah, and so how do we as mayor, right? How do you have those and center those conversations to make sure, right, that is on the people's mind when we're growing?
Look, I think you have to make it a priority because if anything in the last few years has taught us is it is not going to happen by itself. Right? I mean, you can see neighborhoods in Nashville where there's been almost 100% turnover of neighborhoods, right? And I think we've got to find those pathways where growth and economic development is not equivalent to displacement, is not equivalent to people who lived in. I mean, there's families that have lived in neighborhoods for generations that like are starting to feel priced out, and I think we can't let that happen. I think that partially, one of the ways you do that is like helping people preserve their home, trying to make sure that especially elderly folks who are facing raising property taxes get some relief, and trying to make sure that you're guarding against those truly predatory home purchasers, because I don't think that's is in any way helpful to the community. But I also think you're not going to stop people trying to come in and buy land. And for a lot of people, that is their chance to live a better life in a way. We're not going to stop that either.
Right.
But I do think that we got to be committed to having genuinely economically diverse neighborhoods as this is happening.
Right.
I mean, like, it is not success to see. The nation is a good example of a place that used to be almost entirely, rental housing. It was in, reside in residence for working class, and is now almost entirely $800,000 homes.
Right.
You don't need these neighborhoods to flip so starkly, right? Like there's nothing wrong. Like most people that are, I mean, I live right like in that sort of neighborhood. Like most people that are moving to neighborhoods like that want to live in economically and racially diverse communities and don't want that sort of, I mean, there's a reason they're not moving to gated communities in the suburbs. They want to live in the city with everything that means, but that's going to take some real intentional thought about how we build.
I want to stay right there a little bit because what you're talking about like hits on several different things. We're talking about gentrification, the turnover of demographic. I mean, especially here in Nashville, we talk about historical Black neighborhoods, right?
Yep.
Which are predominantly living in the city, right? And so what I've noticed, and I wonder how we have this conversation and just help people understand this and just help the historical residents of these neighborhoods, right? And these schools too. This is the education component. Because, okay, I went to Pearl Cone High School, grew up in that area, right? North Nashville, my whole family, Whites Creek down there, right? So it looked a certain way all the time. And with that is there's a certain economic, threshold of how much money households in that area are making, right? Which you see it in the school system, right? They're funding. Now is gentrification, right? But now these homes are $800,000, but you don't see that going into the schools because they're not sending their kids to these schools as well, right? How do we, one, advocate for these newcomers that are going to these neighborhoods and potentially having kids and having families, send your kids to public schools? How do we have that conversation of really pouring into that community with resources that they now have that historically just wasn't there and historically been neglected by the city? Unpack that. That's a lot of stuff. But I think it's
no. I mean, I love that question, and I want to swing back to the history part on that, but let's talk first about the schools piece that you mentioned at the end, because I think that really is important. And it's not a simple answer,
right?
Because at some level that happens school by school and neighborhood by neighborhood, and like there are some examples of places that have kind of seen the sort of economic growth and change in neighborhoods, but haven't just been totally displacement in nature. And so, man, I'm trying to think of a good example, like Rosebank Elementary, are both good examples where you had, I think, strong principles and you've had a lot of neighborhood commitment as people are from historic neighborhood residents and as people are coming in to trying to make that happen. But it's also required a lot of hard conversations.
Right.
And I think that you're going to have to do some of that. I think that it starts with how do you have the zoning set up? How do you really think about housing as education policy?
Right.
Because if you create a bunch of like rich neighborhoods and a bunch of poor neighborhoods, and you build your school zones around it, then you're creating a bunch of resource schools and a bunch of under-resourced schools.
Right.
And I think we got to be way more intentional about thinking about how we are trying to build that economic diversity into it. And frankly, it's enriching to everybody's children to be in that diverse situation, right? But there's still like ways to get adequate resources everywhere you need it. One of the things that I think the mayor's office needs to do on that resource side too is, teachers need to spend their time being able to teach. And I think the mayor's office needs to be able to sort of align those city services that really aren't about teaching, but that are dealing with all the other stuff that people are bringing to school. Right. Like if you're come to school hungry, if you're come to school with, abuse in the family, if you're come to school dealing with whatever challenges you're coming with, mental health, and there's not a school in Metro that's not dealing with mental health issues sort of in the aftermath of the pandemic. But how do we as a city sort of align those services around our schools so that we're hugging our kids as they go in and letting our teachers do the teaching?
That social service part is really interesting. Because what you're talking about is addressing a lot of things on the front end, right, that need resources, right? as far as those neighborhoods or those kids that live in neighborhoods that may not have a grocery store or access to healthy food, right? How do we get in front of that so they can be, the healthiest minds and bodies to be able to be the best thinkers and problem solvers when they go to school? That's kind of hard to do if you don't have access to food or affordable, healthy foods, right? In communities. Mobility plays a part in that too. The other part of that I really want to get your take on, and when you talk about social services and pouring into schools, which is a big conversation right now because of the mass shootings that have taken place just not here in Nashville, but it's in the nationally, and school resource officers, right? And the funding of school resource officers, which, Governor Lee is going to pour all of this money into. I know Chief Drake is probably like, yes, write the check. Because I know that's something our MNPD and MNPS have that memorandum of, hey, we want SROs in our public schools. Some people feel kind of hesitant about having more police in our middle and high schools, especially those parents that are Black or brown. What are your thoughts on just funding more policing in schools instead of maybe allocating other funds to social emotional learning, counselors, or therapists to handle some of those social services that are happening in school?
So, look, I want to say one thing. Like, there are people out there who I talked to a mom last week who one of the ways that they help convince their third grader to go back into the classroom is they told them about the school resource officer. So there are people out there that unquestionably it makes them feel safer. I think if you actually look at the data on school resource officers, usually when there's armed guards at a school, it actually makes the casualties from shooting events go up, not down. And when you look at what the potential for over policing in our schools and how that can have massive negative consequences for students, I think that it's something that when you do it, you need to do it very carefully. And I think it's a good example of everything that's sort of wrong about the way that Tennessee is approaching these problems. Like, I don't know why we're accepting that school shootings are inevitable and like arming schools to be able to deal with them. Why don't we try to prevent these shootings from happening? And then the bigger issue to me is like, why aren't you surrounding some of the kids like with the counseling, with the social workers, with the interventions that you actually need to prevent? Lots of your school shootings actually happen because of students in the school. And that's because like you got kids that are slipping through the cracks, that aren't feeling loved, that aren't feeling supported, that don't have adults that believe in them. And I think if you take that problem more seriously, you actually reduce violence in our schools, discipline problems in our school far more successfully than than through just SROs. SROs are gonna be here though, and I think that the state has put some restrictions, is gonna put real incentives on that. And I think sort of like it is when we think about policing generally, like we've got to work on how do we make sure that is not that those SROs are not there to become they don't need to be the enforcement side of law enforcement if that's the role they're playing. Like they need to focus in on being the resource, not the officer.
What is your thought on just current policing in Nashville? Chief Drake, I think, has he been there, been chief 2 years now, going about 2 years? What is your thoughts, man, on what the city has done thus far around policing? And as potential mayor, that is an appointed position. You have a lot of say-so or the say-so on what that position looks like, does, what our policing looks like or should be doing in our city.
So, I think a lot about this, and I think it's one of the most important challenges for cities right now. I want to start with making sure that you've got trust, transparency, and accountability. And I think as long as you've got those things, I want to see a well-funded, well-compensated, well-trained set of officers. But I think that those things go together. was I don't think that you actually have, I think if you're not actually dealing with public safety, if you're not dealing with trust in that system at the same time.
Okay.
And so that's the way I think about that. I have a decent relationship with Chief Drake, but I think we got to make sure that, that we are recruiting and training officers that are going to do this work in a way that makes our city proud and every part of our city proud. Right. I also think that more than that, we got to expand the public safety conversation, because when you talk about public safety, it's not just police, right? Like most of the time, if you see three police cars go down your street in an hour, that doesn't actually make you feel safe, right? And I mean, the way I think about safety is significantly broader than that. Like I think about when you have street lights that are out in neighborhoods that don't get repaired, when you have blocks that don't have any activity, don't have any pedestrians, that sort of are those places that can attract sort of more dangerous activity. How are you actually building community in the first place so that you're trying to be conducive to safety? And thinking about programs like violence interrupter programs that frankly end up, I think, being a really big deal if you're trying to think about safety in a more collective, holistic way.
Right. And that goes into mental health too, right?
And I'll tell you, one of the things that I've learned in being in the legislature is that, I've worked on almost every policy issue you can. And I think people should have to stop thinking about mental health as a discrete policy issue, because it's an issue that affects every other issue.
Right.
You can't think about healthcare. You can't think about education. You can't think about violence. You can't think about incarceration. You can't think about homelessness. You can't think about any of those things without having a mental health component to the way you're really thinking about it.
Well, especially, even from a criminal legal system standpoint, 30% of our jail population have a mental health issue.
Davidson County Jail is the largest mental health provider in the state of Tennessee. That should be an embarrassment to all of us.
Yeah, it's crazy. And again, it's like when you think about these services, a lot of people hesitancy is like, should the police be involved in every single aspect of these things? Or is there, or should there, or can there be funding for other professionals that focus specifically on these things?
The way I talk to people is like, because we got a lot of cops and we got a lot of teachers, we want cops and teachers to solve all the problems.
Yeah.
And that's not the work that they necessarily want to do, not the work that they're trained to do, not the work that taxpayers are paying them to do.
Right.
But because that's what we got, we let teachers and police officers be our mental health first responders. Right. We let all these groups that aren't supposed to, they're dealing with homelessness more so than those other parts. And I think we've got to make sure that we're responding way more robustly in that, to having, the right people solving the right problems.
When I mentioned the phrase systemic change, what does that mean, and how does that correlate to you, and especially in terms of the mayoral or the mayor's position?
I love it. Well, I mean, I can't help but think about how much we outlaw teaching about systemic change, barriers change in the legislature, but we in Nashville cannot be blind to that, right? Like I want to talk about sort of at least this systemic racial issues for a second, because it's when you think about where Nashville's population is located, a lot of it dates back to where populations were located at the end of the Civil War.
Right.
And then through lots of different processes over time, from redlining to where we constructed interstates, to where electricity was added, to where schools were built and funded, we have created a lot of systematic injustice. And I always tell you, you don't believe in structural racism, you at least should believe in infrastructural racism. Like, you literally can't cross streets from this part of town to this part of town because we put physical barriers there.
Right.
And I think that you've got to be intentional and thoughtful about that every step of the way. I mean, I think if you're going to be dealing with like new developments, you need to be thinking about how are you connecting communities to one another, and how are you respecting, the challenges and changes that have been, forced upon and halted there.
I'm glad you brought that up as far as new development, and how that connects to just current communities. One of these new developments that are happening is the Titan Stadium.
Yeah.
And the East Bank development in particular, as far as development. What are your thoughts on the Titan Stadium, and how does that harm present communities? Or is there opportunity for the city to be able to do something with the East Bay development specifically that can enhance and give historically neglected communities opportunities, right? Especially where it would be located, kind of where it connects East Nashville and North Nashville and South and West. Like, it kind of connects like all these parts of Nashville in the city. But if you ask me, and if I look back historically at what has happened when these type of developments happen, a lot of times it does not help or benefit black folks or poor folks or brown folks in many cases. And it becomes just another gentrified area that looks good for the elite to be able to come and play and shop and have a good time. What are your thoughts on that, and what kind of position can the mayor be in to be able to kind of have some power, some say-so, some decision-making on how that unfolds? Right.
So, I mean, look, I think council is looking pretty close to confirming this deal to build a stadium. And I think that there's some logic to that. If you just look at the deal itself, it doesn't make sense to have parking lots on the East Bank of downtown. And that stadium does not have like 3 decades left in it under the best of circumstances.
For historical purposes, with people who may not know, when we signed the deal in 96 and 97, it was a bad deal to begin with.
Yeah, right. Like, that's right. And so, I mean, like, I passed the legislation to help move the funding of this stadium off of Nashville taxpayers and on to the people who are coming in as tourists to make sure that that's where the dollars for that come. But you raised the right question, which is exactly the question that I raised with the Titans both last fall when it was in the legislature and when I've had any conversations during the course of this campaign, which is, how do you make sure that that development just doesn't turn into a gentrification engine for East and North Nashville? And how do you then also really, and this is a very precise conversation that I have with sort of some of the team leadership, which is, how do you make sure that when you're building that close to what we're doing with like Envision Case, like, how are you making sure that we are connecting this space, but not in a way that is displacing, but that is genuine, but it stays true to the vision that we have and to the families that have lived in that community.
It is welcoming.
And I think that is a place that the mayor has to make a priority and has to leverage the way that you invest infrastructure on ensuring that the development is going to, as much as possible, support that. Now, I mean, look, there's a level at which, like, I'm not gonna pretend that there's not gonna be some new luxury stuff when you build something like that. There will be, and everybody knows it.
Yeah.
But I do think that doesn't mean that you should be destructive to the community that you're in when you're building and investing.
It's still up in the air. The council could potentially still be cut to 20, right? Right.
Over a longer timeline, if it happens, yes.
Right now, it's still 40. I'm gonna give you my thoughts, and I want you to, because I think this affects the mayor. It affects the whole city, especially if you have 20 council members now. Like, you have to really take who you vote for in your district more. I think more serious. It can't just be a neighbor that you know, like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll vote for you. I think it has to be really more serious if it will spread a broader district, especially in 20. but I think it's also a play on the mayor's power.
Yeah.
And if you cut that down to 20, it's a little tougher to get 11 out of 20 than, 21 out of 40, to kind of maybe vote on a policy or something like that that you would like to move forward with the city. What are your thoughts on that? And even if it's at a longer period, it possibly could still happen during your term as potential mayor.
So, I actually favor the 40-person council, or at least right now, until convinced otherwise, because I think it is so critical to representation in our city. Like in most places, you have county and city government, and so you've got all these different local officials, and so you're likely to be close to someone that is, someone who represents you might live close to your neighborhood.
Right.
Like if you cut Nashville's council down to 15 or 20 districts, you start having every one of those districts would be larger than running for county mayor in most counties.
Yeah.
Like you start making all of those races kind of big time races that are real money, that are real politics. And, I actually think that one of the things that makes the Metro Council strong is that you do have a lot of people who are won because people know them in their neighborhood.
Right.
And they trust them because they've been in their neighborhood for so long. And they're not because they've figured out how to raise a bunch of money. It's not because they figured out how to run, sort of some high-tech mass outreach campaign.
Right.
And I think losing that goes deeper than what the insider issue around what's happening between the mayor and council means. Right. It also just fundamentally ends up making, I think, the council less diverse, less representative, and so one of the reasons that I was opposed to it when it was being discussed at the state level. I think if it happens, I think it's wildly unconstitutional and sort of ran that part of the defense against the new law that has thus far been successful and hopefully will continue to be. But if there's going to be a change, doing it over 4 years and doing it with Nashville hopefully in the driver's seat of that change makes a lot more sense. Our Metro Charter is designed around having this large council. Yeah. Like the way our council works, the way we compensate them, the way we staff them, the way we think about all those relationships depends on is sort of premised on that. And it's just wildly irresponsible not to transition into that. If we end up in a transition to a smaller council, I think one of the fundamental things that both the mayor and the council have to do is to figure out how do people who feel like they're losing voice and losing vote, how do we make sure that they still feel represented in city decisions? Because I think that will be a real challenge, and we might need to think about how do you use the sort of modern technologies or in community outreach to make sure that people feel like they're able to get their voice into the system and get their ideas, their concerns, their complaints, addressed in meaningful ways, because I think we rely on our council people to do that. And if you're gonna double the amount of complaints per council person, you have to figure out some way to do that work.
Right. You talk about got to be full time. They need a staff and all of these things, right?
Well, and frankly, it wouldn't be bad for I think about this from the mayor's office. Part of the way that we should do that job is make sure that we're thinking about getting voice and input and stakeholders bought in all way earlier on decisions, and as part of the way we think about governing from beginning to end. Right. And so, I think if you actually were thoughtful about that in the way that the city was governing itself generally, people might not be quite as terrified when they hear they're going to lose their council person. But I think right now our council people play such an integral role in sort of the lives of communities. That's the only person who knows what school drop off is like in our school, right? It's not, you can't count on your state senator. I'm a state senator. I know what school drop off was like in a lot of my neighborhoods, but not over 200,000 people across the county. Right. And having people that know what those real deal neighborhood problems is a big deal.
As we go on through this growth here in Nashville, we have the big businesses, we know they're going to be all right. but there's the small businesses, right? That we see that through the pandemic, all of these things are still recovering. Do you have any thoughts, initiatives on making sure that one, small businesses are thriving right here in Nashville, as Nashville is growing and there's more economic opportunities for those that can afford it, but those small businesses is what keep things, most people are going to support, and even more, even specifically, black-owned small businesses that usually are, disenfranchised, marginalized, don't get the same amount of funding or opportunities to participate in the economic growth.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have an Office of Economic and Community Development, but oftentimes what that means is like we out recruiting big businesses from elsewhere to bring workers from elsewhere to do work in our city.
Right.
And I think that that's not actually what we should be thinking about when we think about economic development. It should be about how do we grow our own entrepreneurs? How do we have a sort of the funding from a debt side or a venture capital side that we've got sort of the ecosystem that can support people who are trying to start businesses in the first place.
Right.
And that stuff is can be very difficult to navigate. All right. So the state and federal government invested a lot of dollars into workforce development. If you ask any small business owner right now, what they'll tell you is like finding the workforce that I need that's trained to do what I need. Like it's really hard. But they're not even eligible to participate in most of the workforce development initiatives, right? Because all of those partnerships are built on that, with the larger scale companies. Right. And I think that is a place that it might actually make sense from a mayor's office, is to really have individuals who are focused on, like sort of an office that's genuinely focused on small businesses being able to access capital, being able to access workforce training, workforce development, right, so that we're really investing. And then what you mentioned about, when people start, I think one of the most exciting corridors in the city is Jefferson Street, right? Yeah. But when I hear people think about, rebuilding that without thinking about the people who have built businesses there, it drives me crazy. Like if you're not building around the successful businesses of the community as you're launching, like you're not doing this right.
Right. Yeah, and I think too, just as we grow as a city, right? I don't think we grow how we're supposed to do if we're not investing like on business. Right. I think people will come in and say, hold on, wait a minute. And I think we stay that diversely segregated city, that people are just in their bubbles and, really not, trying to break bread with one another. It's still just that kind of two different cities with two different types of people or persons or just groups of individuals.
I think that's right. I think this is one of the big conflicts of the city. I mean, I think aspirationally, look, this is a city where Fisk University was founded in 1866. Yeah. Like you come into, in the middle, right after the Civil War, we're starting Fisk University. In 1960, when every other city in the region was doubling down on segregation, this city followed Diane Nash, John Lewis, and went a different way. Yeah. And we fall short of that promise all the time. Yeah. But if we ever lose sight of the fact that that's the promise that actually our city orients around, I think we've lost who we are.
And I'm glad you brought it up, because there's no way, when you have all of that historical reference of when it comes to social change, Nashville is at the top of that, right?
It is.
And I think it's important for new Nashvillians that are moving here to really understand it and grasp that. Because I don't know if people really understand, and I think maybe even with the Tennessee 3 and everything that happened at the same session, maybe more people are aware, oh, okay. But the historical aspects of our city, it ain't nothing but social change and really going against the grain and doing what others are afraid and don't have that courage to do, but knowing no, this is how we build equity and systemic change for everybody, because we're all affected by it on different levels, right?
That's right.
But this is how you do it. And having a mayor that speaks that and understands that, I think is crucial. Because even though mayor can't go out there and make laws, right? Right. Right. But just because we're a mayor-led city, being able to just hear that vocalized, right? I think would just sit in the souls of so many residents, whether they know or don't know.
I think that's right. And look, here's my view on the legislature and the laws part, is laws are always a lagging indicator. They always follow the cultural change that happens, right? And like, it's more important that this city, if you want to have inclusive laws like 30 years from now, it's more important that cities and communities be inclusive now, right? Like, that's the way that we should think about this as a city. And so, I mean, I think it is absolutely part and parcel of who we are and who we have always been. This has always been a city that is like reform minded, right? Like, we were Athens in the South, like back in the day. Like, and there's a Parthenon, and it was like, people always ask why, but it's because this city was ambitious and wanted to be a center of education then, right? And I mean, there are other examples, right, where the 19th Amendment for women to get the right to vote everywhere in the country was fought right here. But it's also like the resilience for our people, right? Like, people used to make fun of Nashville for being the town of hee-haw. And we're like, no, like Minnie Pearl and Charlie Pride and Dolly Parton, those people are heroes and treasures. And we're going to like build Music City on top of it, which is now everything from Jack White to the TSU band winning Grammys.
Right.
And I think that is the kind of city we are and have to be.
The mayoral position here in Nashville is a very powerful position. And so I would like you to define that word power and what that means to you. People look at power as a good thing. People look at power as a bad thing. But I would love to hear your definition of what that just means personally to you. No, you don't have to know Webster or Oxford, but just what that means to you.
No, I think what power means is responsibility. I mean, it doesn't necessarily matter that you mean well when you're mayor. Like, you're responsible for consequences. You're responsible for outcomes. And so when you see injustices in your city, when you see problems go unaddressed, like, you got to be responsible for those and use whatever power you have in that office to actually address those issues. I mean, I think the implementation of power is a very different thing. And I think a lot of people will think through, like, what are you doing in the mayor's office? But like, at the end of the day, that's a big part of it. A lot of employees work for Metro. There's a big budget, but this is a way bigger city than that. I mean, if you put all of the Metro budget that was available into housing, you still wouldn't be catching up with half, a tiny percentage of the housing that actually gets built in this town, right? Like, there's so much more to the power of this city, and power is something that when you actually have coalitions built from the state to the city to the streets to the neighborhoods, that's when you've actually got real power to make things happen.
I'm glad you brought up budget, because I wanted to get in this, and I always kind of end telling off with budget. Because the one I do because creating that budget for the city is probably, if not the number one job, has to be in the top two jobs of our Nashville mayor, right? It's a year-long process, and then people are really not worried about it until it comes pretty much to the end. What's going on the budget, and it's only so many resources, only so many things that can be funded. I think we have maybe like a almost $3 billion budget here in Nashville. What are your thoughts on being able to work with the budget that we have here in Nashville? Many people believe that we don't have any money. We can't do anything, right? We can't fund too much. But every year, police, public safety, police gets this, education gets this. There's been some historical giving in the last year, during the current administration and things like that. So I always like to give listeners and viewers some type of insight on budget and how our potential next mayor also views our budget and working with what we have to create the change that we need.
I mean, all budgets are moral documents to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And like they show a lot about what you're going to be committed to.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the single biggest line item is what the single biggest line item should be, which is our K through 12 education system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you do not have a great city if you do not have great schools. And I think that you ought to be able to trust that you've got schools that will give your kids the best opportunity, regardless of where you live in this county.
Right.
And so I think that means making sure that the resources that are available for those schools are not what's holding us back.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, I think that's fundamental. I think that you also have to think about safety. Because again, if you don't have a safe city, oftentimes you don't keep your city.
Right.
And I think that can get misread. And I tried to talk about that earlier. I think that you got to think about what safety means, and the fact that we're seeing pedestrian deaths double again over a 7-8 year period. That does not make me feel safe.
Right.
That does not make the fact that people have to wait for the bus on the side of the edge of the shoulder, like feeling like they're in a ditch. That does not make people feel safe. But that also then goes to like where you got mental health, how you're cutting down on illegal guns and gun thefts in your community. And then obviously it goes to policing as well, because we're under, like, the number of officers we have is lower right now than like the intent. And like there's just sometimes that I've talked to people all the time that feel like they had somebody break in their car and they can't get the police to respond to things like that. And so I think we all are aware of the challenges in that for that, but we got to deal with the other. The other piece that we've got to prioritize from a budgeting standpoint is getting our heads around growth and infrastructure, because the growth and development of businesses and restaurants and tourist spots and all these things is going up at this exponential level.
Right.
But the growth of our sidewalks and roadways and transit and infrastructure and services is growing at a much, lower rate.
Yeah.
I mean, like, we'll get our sidewalks finished in 250 years. Like, that's not good enough, right? We're gonna figure out some way to line those things up better and to more effectively leverage the public dollars. Right. Like when you're putting public dollars into infrastructure and into housing, that needs to be leveraged with private dollars, with nonprofit dollars, to get the maximum bang for your buck. Because nobody wants to see the taxes be soaring in this place. Right. And so that means that we got to get the most out of the dollars we got and protect what we do, but we got to focus hard on the priorities. You don't want to just kind of do everything okay, right? Like some of it, we're going to have to really make some tough decisions. Right. Hard part about being mayor, one of the hardest parts, is you got to say no all the time. Right. Oftentimes to 8 ideas that are great, you get to say yes to one of them.
Yeah.
And I think that we got to make sure that your team has got enough input to make that decision well about when and how you're making those prioritized decisions.
And I think from the community too, we're okay with the no's. We just would like the transparency on like how it came to that no. And okay, we can live with that.
I think the participatory citizens budget process that started in the city is one of the most important things that's happened, and also it needs to get rolled out even bigger, frankly. That ought to be like on your app, on your phone, like part of like what you can see, right?
Yeah. Just people to Stella, we gotta wrap it up now. As we close, I'm gonna give you the time to speak to anything that we maybe didn't touch on. You want to extrapolate something more to the people out there, the potential voters in this next mayoral campaign, and then also once you with that, let people know where they can go to support you and support your campaign.
Well, first, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on and talking about these, a lot of bigger issues facing the city. I think fundamentally right now, this is an election that's about Nashville's future, just like every election is about the future. But there's a lot of people who want to decide what Nashville's future is going to look like. There's a lot of people in the state capitol that want to have a say in what Nashville's future looks like. There's a lot of people who are nothing but hedge fund investors who are trying to extract dollars from Nashville without really investing here, who are trying to dictate some of what Nashville's future is.
Yeah.
But the future of this city has to be driven by what makes sense for our people and is consistent with our values.
Yeah.
When it comes to the things where the hard decisions have to get made, I think we have to have a clear sense of who we are as a city and what values matter to us. I mean, so occasionally people mention that we've lost the soul of the city. I don't buy that. Because when I go, I don't care which part of town I go to, I think the people in Nashville are still doing amazing things. And like communities are still coming together to solve problems in their town. You saw with the Covenant School, like this city came together to support those folks, to comfort one another, to help one another, to not say no together. And I think the soul of Nashville's doing just fine.
Yeah.
But we can't sacrifice that ever. Like that part of us that makes us Nashville, we have to hold true to that. And the decisions we make as a government, from the disputes that we have with the state, to the budget decisions we make, to the way in which we grow and develop, have to make it a better place to live for all of our folks. Like I mean it when I say it shouldn't feel like winning the lottery to live in a home you can afford, in a safe neighborhood you love, near schools you trust, and be able to get from here to there.
Right.
Like that's the baseline that should exist for everybody in our city, regardless of where they're from. And want to ask you for your vote.
Yeah.
And also love to ask anybody listening to the podcast to vote for me for mayor on August 3rd. And if you don't live in Nashville, you're still listening, we can find you a realtor and get you here before August. It's not a problem. But, and I would love to have people get involved in the campaign. And obviously would love to have that be your financial help. Not going to lie, I am not a millionaire. I did not have the capacity to put $2 million of my own money into the race. So I'm going to be doing this a lot more with people who are writing me $10, $15, $20 checks. So you can go online at jeffyarbro.com, give one of those. And if I would love for you to do that and volunteer, but you can also just volunteer, because we need people who are going to go out, knock doors, host house parties, tell friends, and then share with us what your ideas and thoughts on the city are. Because that's really, at the end of the day, the national mayor's race is about having a decision-making process as a city, about what matters to us and what kind of future we're going to choose. And hopefully that's a future we're going to choose together.
Senator Yarbro, appreciate your time. Thank you. Good luck on the campaign, and you're welcome back anytime.
I love it. Thanks.